So last night we had primary elections in Kentucky and Pennsylvania, and we're going to take a look at what these primary elections mean for the electorate going forward into 2023, because both of these states have some pretty key races. Of course, Kentucky has its governor's race between now nominee for the Republican Party, Daniel Cameron, and of course incumbent governor Andy Beshear. And the Pennsylvania races have to do with the state Superior Court and the state Supreme Court. And if Republicans flip those seats, they're going to be increasing their presence on the benches there. So both important races. Obviously, there's other governor races. So while these races aren't the most high profile, there's really never a slow year in American politics. There's always some important races going on somewhere. So we're going to take a look at what these primary elections mean about the electorate and ultimately how these races could potentially shape up in the general election. I will be making a separate video about Kentucky in the next couple of days, so stay tuned for that because we're not going to go too in depth with it in today's video. So of course, before we begin, as always, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So first, we're going to start off with the state of Kentucky, and then we'll move on to Pennsylvania. So Daniel Cameron, who for the longest time I think was always heavily favored in the primary. I always assumed Daniel Cameron was going to be the nominee for the Republicans here. Donald Trump endorsed Daniel Cameron some time ago, so it was very well known that he was the Trump endorsed candidate. And, you know, in a pretty packed field, I mean, you've got really only 3 high-profile contenders, but Daniel Cameron getting about 47% of the vote is pretty good, especially considering how many people are actually running in this primary. You know, none of these other lower tier candidates really got any traction. The race was really between these top 3. And honestly, many expected Kelly Craft to be more competitive since she spent by far and away the most amount of money in this primary. I think she spent around $8 million. It could be more than that. Daniel Cameron only spent about $2 million. But of course, he had higher name recognition and the Trump endorsement. Now, some in Trump world have tried to make this a proxy battle between Trump and DeSantis, and I think that's a bit disingenuous considering DeSantis endorsed Kelly Craft at the last minute, literally the day before the primary, and I think it was really from the standpoint of a low risk, high reward strategy. The Crafts are a very wealthy family and of course big profile GOP donors. So obviously if DeSantis were to endorse the Crafts and they somehow won this primary, that obviously would look very good on him and also put him in the good graces of these Republican donors. But on the flip side, of course, it's been seen as sort of a sneaky last ditch move considering it was the day before the primary. So I don't think it's very genuine to argue that this was a proxy battle, since I think if it was, DeSantis would have put a lot more energy behind this endorsement and campaigned for Kraft, or at least stumped for her, or did this a lot earlier. But that didn't happen, and I think really this isn't going to be a very newsworthy proxy war. Again, there's many of other proxy wars you could point to between Trump and DeSantis. I really don't think the Kentucky Republican primary is one of them. I mean, he did endorse Kelly Craft, a different candidate than Donald Trump, but I really don't think it was to snub him. I think it was more so to get more allies on his side, because really, if you're going to knock off the presumptive GOP nominee, and as of right now, Trump is the presumptive nominee for the Republicans. I mean, let's face it, nobody's polling anywhere close to him. DeSantis, his second closest rival, is polling in the low 20s as of right now. Now, I've always stressed that it's very early on in the process. You know, at this point in 2015, Trump hadn't even announced yet, so he wasn't even a factor. A lot can certainly change. Again, Trump has a core segment of the base. It's around 30 to 40%. You've got a lot of people leaning towards Trump that are obviously inflating his poll numbers, and I don't doubt they'll probably vote for Trump in the primary if current trends continue. But this primary certainly isn't over, and I think 2024 is going to be a much more serious primary on the Republican side than we saw back in 2020 when Trump was basically coronated to be Republican nominee. And I think that's totally fair considering he was the incumbent president. You're not going to oust the incumbent president. There really wasn't any major policy reasons to do so. His approval rating was about the same as always, but let's face it, electorally, he was in a much stronger position to beat Joe Biden in 2020 than any other Republican would have been if he had been replaced. You can't really replace the coach halfway through the game, and I think that's ultimately why you saw a very uncompetitive primary. But 2024, I don't think is going to be very uncompetitive. But taking a look at this map here at Daniel Cameron, he basically performed very well all over the place. I think Louisville is probably one of his strongest areas, but he has pretty strong support throughout the rural parts of the state. But I think Louisville and sort of northern Kentucky was really his stronghold in this primary. Kelly Craft, for somebody who spent so much money in this primary, really only got a handful of rural counties in central and south Kentucky. So really not a lot to show for all the money she put into this race. Many of her critics have argued that she was not the most charismatic, came off as a little bit robotic, sort of the classic politician, if you will. And I think there's still a large segment of the Republican base that does not long for the return of business as usual with Republican politicians. And then you could argue that's one of the reasons why they backed Daniel Cameron. Now, of course, Daniel Cameron, in his victory speech, credited his victory for Trump's endorsement, which I'm sure was part of it, but I think also it had to do with him being the sitting AG as well. And again, he really was going to win this primary, I think, no matter what, whether Trump intervened or not. I think even with Kelly Craft's fundraising, it was very clear from this result that she really didn't make that much of a dent. I mean, she came in at third place. You would think with that sort of money, she would at least make it a lot more competitive with Daniel Cameron. So switching gears, we're going to take a look at Pennsylvania now. Again, the Kentucky down ballot races we're not going to talk about too much because they're not very significant. But, you had a primary in Philadelphia. Cheryl Parker has won that primary. I don't really know too much about this candidate, only that I think she somewhat endorsed stop and frisk policing policy, which I think is probably some good news in Philadelphia, considering crime has been really, really out of control in that area. And even Democrats are starting to realize that urban crime in America particularly violent crime, has skyrocketed since 2020, and soft on crime policies have just enabled this crime wave to continue. So out of the other candidates, Helen Jim, I know, was a very progressive candidate, so I think it's probably a good direction for Philadelphia to go in. I think you need to see more of these sort of tough on crime mayors in big cities backing police to try and get a handle on sort of just this out of control violent crime in America's cities. But the main race I want to focus on is the state Supreme Court race in Pennsylvania. Now, we had another race for the state Supreme Court in Wisconsin earlier this year. It was a total disaster for the GOP. They lost by 11 points. Complete disaster. But this seat in Pennsylvania gives them a chance to sort of redeem themselves. Now, the Pennsylvania GOP has not been very competent in recent years. They did manage to flip some down ballot races in 2020, but their last main high-profile success statewide and federally was Pat Toomey, who was first elected in 2010, re-elected in 2016, declined to run in 2022, and of course Republicans went on to lose that Senate seat to Democrats by around 5 percentage points. So the Pennsylvania Republican Party has been struggling, to say the least. Of course, they also nominated far-right Trump candidate Doug Mastriano, who ended up getting absolutely pulverized. Again, this was a state that Joe Biden only won by 1.2%. He ended up losing by nearly 15 percentage points and losing areas that traditionally vote very Republican. I mean, Beaver County was a safe Republican county. Cumberland County was a county Trump won by 10. Luzerne County was a safe Republican county. Counties, Lancaster was a safe Republican county. All of these areas that are sort of bellwethers for Republicans' performances, he did absolutely horrendous. The floor for Mastriano just totally caved in, and it was just a complete disaster. So this is really a chance for Republicans to sort of get their act together. Now, I bring up Doug Mastriano because he endorsed Patricia McCullough in this primary. She was sort of running as the, separation of church and state, MAGA 2020 Stop the Steal candidate, which really is a relic now, I think, of the past, at least in the eyes of most voters. I mean, nobody really wants to relitigate 2020, regardless of your opinions on it. And Republicans would be very unwise to put forth a candidate that wants to keep opening up that door. And time again, the general electorate has resoundingly rejected it. Typically voters don't like sore losers. And, it's really an issue that is settled in most voters' minds. I mean, the vast majority of voters don't buy a lot of the Republican claims. And even if they are sympathetic to some, they're tired of hearing about it. And I think Patricia McCullough losing, who was the Mastriano-endorsed candidate, is a very good sign for the Pennsylvania GOP, which means this seat could actually be in play. I think if McCullough had won this primary, this would have been a done deal. She wouldn't have been able to raise any money. She probably would have lost by a pretty considerable margin statewide. But now that you have a candidate who I think comes from Montgomery County, She got 84% in that county, so she's a judge in Montgomery County. And really, the Philly suburbs bailed her out in this primary. I mean, you look at some of the margins in the rural areas, McCullough was doing very, very well. Carluccio really represented the more standard Republican candidate, type of candidate that can actually appeal to suburban Philly. And one of the weaknesses of the Mastriano and Oz campaign wasn't just the rural areas, although they fell really far in those areas too, but they failed to really make any ground in the Philadelphia suburbs. In fact, they only trended Chester County 0.1%. Of course, that was Oz, not Mastriano. Every single county in Pennsylvania trended left for Mastriano. But for Oz, he only trended Chester County about 0.1% to the right, and maybe Pike County. He had 2 counties trend in his favor. But all of these other suburban Philly counties really should have come in a lot better for him. And ultimately, I think somebody like Carluccio, who is from the Philly suburbs, has a much more moderate, old-school Republican image, could actually appeal to these voters. And in a more low-turnout election where you really don't have control of the court at stake, so I don't really think abortion is going to be as big of an issue, especially since Democrats are still going to control the Supreme Court. Regardless of this outcome, this just gives, of course, Republicans a little bit more of a say, and it also provides them a bit of a moral victory to prove that the party is still competent and can still win statewide elections after the disaster that was 2022. So Carluccio is certainly in a much better position than somebody like Patricia McCullough would have been. Thankfully for Republicans, McCullough lost, and you now have a candidate that I think can do a lot better in a general election. Of course, the Democratic primary, you have Daniel McCaffrey. I think he's obviously doing to be favored just because of the fact that Pennsylvania is really a lean blue state. This is not a purple state really anymore. I think 2016 gave many voters the illusion that Pennsylvania was this purple 50-50 swing state. And while it is very close, I think Democrats still have a very fundamental edge in the state of Pennsylvania when it comes to statewide races. I mean, honestly, in any election over the past decade, whether you've got a Democrat or a Republican, the Democrat is just far more likely to win that race, even if they win by only a couple of points. And even if you look at the ceilings in those races, Democrats can win elections in Pennsylvania by 5, by as much as 15 points. When's the last time you've seen a Republican win a statewide office in Pennsylvania by 15 points? I mean, you probably have to go back maybe to Arlen Specter in 2004, but I think he won by less than 15. So you've got to go back a really long time to find a Republican that can win Pennsylvania by double digits. Republicans have a very low ceiling in Pennsylvania. It's about 51%. Democrats have a pretty low floor in the state of Pennsylvania. It's about 47%. So again, going into this state Supreme Court race, I think it's very likely that Democrats are going to be favored, but Carluccio could certainly pull an upset. And I think in regards to Kentucky, I think Beshear, who's very popular at the moment, has the advantage in this race. But it's certainly not impossible that Daniel Cameron could pull an upset victory here. And it's very funny we call this an upset victory because we're talking about Kentucky. But when you have a state where the incumbent governor is nearly 60% in approval, I would consider an upset for that governor to be ousted. So we'll see what ends up happening ultimately in these races. We still got months of preparation ahead now that these primaries are over. We're going to kind of get to see what the general election campaigns are going to be like, and ultimately we can make sort of a better determination from there. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.